Hey, everybody. My name is Quincy. I'm the director of the Teaching and Learning Center. We're really appreciative for you all taking time out of your day, out of your week to come join us today. We believe that this is a really exciting conversation that we're going to have today. I'm excited to introduce our facilitator for our discussion. Many of you already know her, Dr. Barbara Maxwell. She's our Director of Interprofessional Education and Collaboration at ATSU. Barbara Maxwell, Dr. Maxwell has a long-standing passion for building educational environments that foster a sense of community. To do so, she also believes that it requires an explicit attention and to the provision of an inclusive environment, not just from the student's perspective, but also from the faculty and staff perspective. Her philosophy devised from her experience as well as from her training is that building community doesn't happen by chance, that it happens when it's intentional. Dr. Maxwell has taught doctoral level courses on cultural awareness, competency, and proficiency, as well as the impact on social determinants of health. She's also spoken at international conferences on the topic of diversity and inclusion. And she's currently working with colleagues from the National Academies of Practice to examine how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be operationalized at the organizational level. Without further ado, I would like to extend a warm welcome. Please help me to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Maxwell to lead this interesting yet and as well as important discussion about building community in our classrooms. Dr. Maxwell, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Quincy. I want to acknowledge, as Quincy said, I've been doing work with a group out of the National Academies of Practice, and I just want to acknowledge that the really robust, challenging, difficult conversations and work that we've been engaged in together has shaped a lot of what I'm sharing with you today. So whatever I share is actually a reflection of many of the conversations and difficult conversations that we have had as a group. So I want to recognize those colleagues that I work with at the National Academies of Practice. So before we start, I have a question for you, and I'd like you to put your answer to the question in the chat. And the question is, can learning take place if, in fact, the voices of the people that it's intended to teach are silenced? Okay, we have a few responses there in the chat that absolutely not, doubtful, no. We have one yes. Depends on the learning, can take place without speaking. Silence can be powerful. So the majority of people have said no. Others have provided some provisos for the situations in which it can happen. But according to Henry Giroux, who has written these marvelous books, one of which is Border Crossing, Cultural Workers in the Politics of Education, according to him, they do learn, but what they learn is that they don't count. So if you do not include the voice of all of the participants in your learning environment, all that they learn is that they don't count. And so today's session's framed around that notion that to truly support learning, and all of the strategies we'll cover today, not only are strategies for inclusive teaching, they're actually strategies for excellence in teaching. So the two go hand in hand. If you actually embrace inclusive initiatives, you'll actually be doing a really good job on your teaching quality altogether. So when I started putting this session together, and I've told Brittany and Quincy this, my overarching thought was, I wish we had more time. We cannot do this topic justice in 1 hour, and probably less than, because we have to kind of get in and out. The topic's really complex and it involves many, many concepts, some of which are on the screen. And to do justice to it takes time. It takes really deep reflection. a willingness to be open, to be challenged. It's difficult, it's controversial, and it often involves upsetting conversations because you have to address really difficult topics to go beyond that to truly learn. So you need a willingness to go beyond the rhetoric that is often just spoken about in this space and recognize your own positionality, where you sit. A willingness to address racism, not just to say you're not racist, but to be anti-racist. It requires you to deal with inequity and inclusion and privilege, and you have to do it head on. Lip service is absolutely not enough. So it requires action, actually action, to change and challenge power dynamics, to ensure the representation of all of the students and participants you have in your class, or all of the colleagues that you have working with you, or all of the people that we have working in the university. And we have to amplify the voices of those who are subjugated or marginalized. And you might think that doesn't happen, but I'm going to show you in a moment that it does. So let's start by recognizing that our session just cannot do all of this. It's a taster. And I hope this hour will really allow you to reflect on the environments that we create in our academic settings, particularly the classroom environment, which is the focus today. And that hopefully what the session will do is ignite a desire for you to dive deeper into these really crucial issues. So the two pieces that we're going to focus on today are the social identities. So we're going to discuss social identities and how these are connected to inclusive excellence. And we're going to talk and share and learn about different strategies for inclusive teaching that actually embrace a really wide range of those identities and can foster an inclusive climate in your classroom. So that's the piece of the puzzle that we're going to focus on today. In this little comment comes straight from our website, from our diversity section of our university website. And it shows that ATSU has voiced a commitment to diversity. You'll also find on the website this letter from Clinton Normore, our Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. And within it, he actually points out two particular areas where you'll see inclusion is voiced in this letter to the community. So the presentation today is coming from a hope that we will actually center our discussions on the assumption that this is a shared value that we all hold. And so that's where it's going to come from. However, I'd argue that to fully embrace this particular value, we need to engage in an enhanced engagement, implementing specific strategies and addressing equity and inclusion in the policies that marginalize individuals or create inequities. And so we're going to focus a little bit on, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but mostly on inclusion. So I hope this session is a really good catalyst for the good work that many of you may already be doing. So to kick us off thinking a little deeper, you'll see on the screen that some comments. And I really want to take a moment to challenge the assumption that we all know how to create an inclusive environment, and we all do it. The comments on the screen come from an article from Clark and Hurd. It's right of the moment. It was released in 2020, and it's of our world. This is this wonderful article, and it'll be posted in the chat. It speaks to racial inequity in the biomedical sciences. And addressing racism and disparities, particularly in the biomedical sciences. So this is our world. This is medical education, health professions education, biomedical science. This is exactly our world. And these comments, and I challenge you to read them and not be upset by them. If you're not upset, I'm very worried about you. But these comments actually come from colleagues. So this would be us in our academic environment and our peers talking about our peers. And it's quite shocking. And I say this is right of the moment of how people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color are these are their reflections on things that have actually been said to them. And I think it's very easy for people to pull who are minorities or who are marginalized or feel that they're on the edge of everyone else. It's very easy for them to come up with these examples. It takes no thought. And there's many of us who could not come up with any of these examples because we sit in a position of privilege. So I'm really going to encourage you to read this article. It's a short read, but it's actually incredibly powerful and direct to our environment. And it shows many of the inequities that are there in the exact places in which we teach. So let's talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really the main message here is that it's not about numbers. A lot of institutions have gone to, we need to think about diversity. So let's do a scan, let's do a survey, let's see who we are, let's see who we have here. And it kind of stops there. So we need to think really very deeply about the trifecta of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how they all are superimposed on one another. We need all three to really do a good job in making an inclusive environment. So a lot of the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion have been particularly highlighted given that we're living in a pandemic, and a lot that was hidden is now incredibly visible, let alone the issues that we've had with social injustice. There's currently a moment when things that were previously hidden or ignored have risen to the surface. And so if we're really going to deal with equity and inclusion, we're going to get all the way to inclusive classroom. Counting the numbers is not enough. Inclusive excellence has diversity and equity at its core. So we're going to talk very briefly about equity, and then we're going to launch into a much deeper conversation together about inclusion. So the concept of equity is really anchored on fairness and justice, and how we can achieve that. To do that, equity needs some structural changes, process changes. We need to change what we do in the classroom, we need to change what we do in our policies and procedures, and we need to change what we do at a university level. And I'm sharing this really thinking about, I saw Marty on the screen there, and I really was thinking a lot about Marty's presentation, which is the second in the series, and talking about students with accommodations. And so we were thinking about the different accommodations that students have access to, but one of the route to those accommodations is to have an up-to-date psychological assessment. And I actually raised in Marty's session that there are students who, from their economic standpoint, can't afford to have that done. Marty mentioned how a lot of the students had evaluations that were done when they were in school, not at university, but in school. And when they're in school, they're largely done for free. So it's a requirement often of the educational environment. And so students, when they move into higher education, can use those, but when they come to us, they can't. So if you think about equality, equity, and justice end of things, what can we do as an institution when we recognize that the socioeconomic status of a student does not allow them access to accommodations because they cannot afford to have the psychological testing? So if we really want to get to justice, we have to do something as a university about what we do for students who are of low socioeconomic status and cannot afford that evaluation, because they then do not have access to accommodations. So this is I really thank Marty for raising that in that session, because it highlights things where we need to take it beyond recognizing it, and we actually need to do something about it. So let's move on to inclusion. And it's more than simply diversity. It's more than the numbers and the representation of people. Inclusion is about creating an authentic environment where people are actually empowered to participate. and a true sense of belonging. And it's something that often people just say, well, I'm welcoming to my students. I don't bias against my students. I don't create an environment. But when you speak to the other side of the equation and you speak to students, they will very quickly tell you ways in which you've marginalized them or you've cut them off from the conversation. And even good intentions can go awry. I can think of something I did in a cultural competence class where I asked the students were watching the movie Crash to learn about stereotypes. And the students, certain religious students of a particular religion in the class, did not want to watch the movie because it had swearing in it and sexual content and things like that. But the power of the movie is incredibly good. So one of the students offered to give me a DVD player that would screen out the sexual parts, the swearing parts that he actually used at home. And so we had 2 screenings of it. One that you could go to if you didn't mind seeing it as it originally was, and one that you could see if you did not want to see that content, if you had objections to the content, that particular content of the movie, but you could still see the stereotyping issues of the movie. I had a real backlash from some of the students who watched the screened version because they believed that all of the other students should have watched the same version as them, and that they were marginalized because they were put in a different place to watch their version of the movie. So good intention, but it didn't work out quite the way that I hoped. But it was actually a really powerful opportunity to use that moment. And that's one of the inclusive strategies. Don't let a moment like that go by. It's a really powerful moment where I could actually talk to the class about that, about the intent, about what was received, about how it caused upset, it wasn't intended to. So it's about that sense of truly belonging. So you might have seen these before, and these are wheels. We're going to talk about identity, and these are wheels of social and personal identities. So I want you to take a moment to start to reflect on your own personal identities, and think about, and I'm going to enlarge it a little bit so that if you're like me and you wear glasses and you don't see much, you can see them a little better. So these are the identities that we hold either because of there are social identities, so their age, class, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, gender, language, our legal status. You can see them all on the screen. There's more than that. And our personal identities are things about our political views, our profession, the sports team. You know very much that it changes people's identity when they really hook on to some particular sports team. There are personality traits, our geographical or community affiliation. So you can see them all on the screen. So I want you to take a moment, and I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Brittany, because we're going to ask you a question in Mentimeter. What identity do you think about most often? So Brittany, I'm going to hand over to you.
There we go.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so we can see we've got a good lot of you who've responded. 21. So let's start talking about. So in your individual self, you think a lot about your as a group. We have a lot of people thinking about their profession, about their ability and their health, their age, some about their sexuality, sexual orientation. That's up towards the top. And a few less about, about their gender, a few less about their legal status and sexuality, and a little bit more than that on race and ethnicity. So we're going to ask you to take the second question on your Mentimeter. So there's a second question for you that asks you, now think about as a professional, which identities are most important. So we've got profession, ability and health again, age, and less so about the majority of the others. Thanks so much, Brittany, for sharing that with us. I'll go back to screen share.
And Dr. Maxwell, we had a question in the chat before you segue. Do you want me to read it to you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If I don't try to overthink any category and just see students or people, how would I rate that?
How would you raise it with the students? I'm not too sure on, let me pull up the chat here and I'll be able to see it directly. Nope, I'm not seeing it there. Can we hold that one and progress on, and we'll go back, but I promise we'll go back to it at the end. Brittany, will you remind me to
Absolutely.
do that? Perfect, perfect. Okay, so we're talking about identity because some identities are quite set and other identities change. So when you're thinking about yourself as an individual and a professional, your identities will shift and tend to shift. Your identities can also change over time, over circumstances, over different situations and settings. So for example, I am, my nationality is British, Irish, and American. And I reveal those in different ways in different settings. I actually come from Northern Ireland, which is British, technically British, and grew up in an environment where to disclose whether you believed yourself to be British or Irish was very dangerous. I grew up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and we were being bombed for whatever side we were on. People were being shot. I remember a boyfriend of my sister's was shot through the hands. Because they were looking for his dad, and his dad wasn't in. He happened to work for the prison service. So it was a difficult environment and really difficult to disclose your identity. I know now I'm out of that environment, but I'm also aware that when I disclose myself as Irish, I very much get the very first Irish stereotype. So I get people saying, oh, you're Irish. I'm thought of, I would say, as less intelligent, as probably reliant on alcohol, as funny. And so the Irish stereotypes come in incredibly quickly. If I reveal myself to British, I recognize that I am thought of as being more intellectual, a little bit more up in the socioeconomic status. So how I choose to represent my national heritage has safety issues in one place, and another place has cultural issues, intellectual issues. And so identities do shift. So don't think of your students' identities as being set, or that they will reveal them all to you in any particular setting. So thinking about your students, what identities, think about the identities that you think are represented in your classroom. And also, if you think about them, do you know for sure what identities are being represented in your classroom? Working from home, studying from home, getting a view into the students' world through Zoom, which can be quite intrusive at times, is quite enlightening into the issues that students have at home with regards to economic status, marital status, trying to look after children, having noisy dogs and cats. All types of issues about the students have been revealed, and about us have been revealed thanks to us moving to a Zoom world during the pandemic. So we've revealed a little bit more about our students, but think about that, so those other aspects of your students' lives. And it may well be that you think you know who your students are, but you might be at the top of this iceberg where you see the visible things, but you don't see the hidden things, the things that the students don't reveal. You certainly don't know about their past experiences unless you ask them, and the things that have shaped who they are. So you have to be willing to get to know your students. Not everything about them, but you have to create environments in which they feel that they can actually speak up. So the majority of the rest of our time together, you're going to be in a breakout room. And you're going to be in a breakout room discussing these two questions. And again, we have a Mentimeter set for you to answer 2 questions. You'll find a different link for it in the chat. So we want you to think about which identities do you actively make efforts? And we're talking about active, and it's okay to say, I haven't thought about this before, so I don't think I'm doing it. Or I haven't thought about this before, but maybe this is one. Or if you've really attended to it, then certainly share the identities that you've willfully tried. So think it's active, it's not passive, it's active. And what specific actions? The second question is, what specific actions does this involve? What are the things that you're doing? After 15 minutes, we're going to pull you back in and we're going to give you an extra resource and some more questions, but it'll be literally a drop in, pick up the resource and drop out. So you'll have a good long time in your breakout rooms. So any questions about the breakout rooms before we send people into them? No, okay. Then let's pop everyone into their breakouts. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a robust discussion in your small groups. Small for a reason. It's a strategy that you can actually use to amplify the voice of students, is to make sure that the groups are small enough that people have an opportunity to speak and that they're not overwhelmed by the loud voices in the group. So when you have groups of about 4 students, or maybe 5 students, and it's a really good way. 4 to me is perfect as a group to have the students really have an opportunity to share, especially if the time that you have is small. And then obviously, if we had more people here, we would have facilitators who would work to make sure that each of those voices had an opportunity to be raised. You'll also notice that there is of what I'm saying in the bottom of the screen. It's a feature of PowerPoint that you just have to turn on. And even with my heavy Northern Ireland accent, it is still picking up the majority of what I say pretty accurately. And so you'll see through this session, we're using what's called the play in a play. And that there's some of the strategies we would recommend for you with students. We're trying to use, like the pronouns, identifying your pronouns, and as to say, using the feature down the bottom of your screen where it's capturing what I say, and the small groups. So let's see which type of identities you actively made efforts to include in class. And I hear that some of you thought it was your identity, and some of you realized that we're asking about the students, but it doesn't really matter. It's still identity. And so obviously gender came up as the largest to be discussed. Profession, race, age, religion, language, and ethnicity, and work experience. At the beginning, the first few groups were dropping in. There was a lot on socioeconomic status. And so let's have another look at the second question that we asked you, which are about what are the strategies that you actively engage in. And so not assuming the students have certain experiences. Content is representative of the population first and foremost. The awareness of culture, language, economics, age of students. They'll place students at a disadvantage during instruction and assessments. Showing images of people from diverse backgrounds doing things that are not always stereotypical. That's incredibly important. Use various pronouns, especially her and she. Integration into classes, exam items, and class discussions. Sharing personal information. Yes, connecting with your students is really important. And share and get info and images from the college mascot. I need to ask you a little bit more, maybe from the universities from which they came. That might be that related to that, which was in the first, in the word cloud. Continuous feedback, asking students if they are comfortable and if they need to do something different, making myself available for questions and providing extra support. So we've had you think a little bit about what you currently do. We're going to move you forward and pop you back in your rooms. So Brittany, I'm going to take over the screen share if you're okay with that. We're going to ask you now to think about thinking about strategies for inclusive teaching that embrace a wide range of social identities and support an inclusive classroom. And in the chat box, you will see a resource shared with you, which are the 5 principles as pathways to inclusive teaching from Kachani and colleagues. I would just point out that you'll see them on the screen, but you will have them to take into your group. So make sure you capture that file that's being loaded into the chat and take it with you into your group. And you're going to reflect on your beliefs about, I would say, start at the bottom. I think they have this the wrong way round. And that if we're going to really be effective, we have to start with number 5, which is reflect on your own beliefs about teaching. I saw in the word cloud that someone said slow learners were something that they take into account. That to me would be one of those reflective moments to say why. Students by their very nature are not slow learners. There's something environmental that we can probably do. There's something we can do with the way that we're delivering materials or what we're asking of students that can actually support their learning, even though we know that people do learn concepts at different times. So we can allow more time for concept understanding. But that's a question that I would absolutely love to dive into, just to say, why do you think these learners are not learning as expeditiously as other learners? And that's a real learning opportunity for us as instructors and academics to actually bury ourselves into that question and say why. So why are these students slower to gain the key concept? So I would say start with 5, but we're going to ask you to think about each of these principles. And so we're going back in our breakout rooms, and you're going to discuss how might you apply these principles of inclusive teaching in your courses. Okay, I did tell you at the beginning that 1 hour is not enough. I want to just leave you with some next steps, things, and I really would love to do more in-depth sessions, but for now, I really would advise the Clark and Hurd article, reflect on what we've been able to cover in this session, consider what was discussed in your breakout rooms, and consider your own iceberg, what you know and what you don't know about the people that you work with, about the students that you work with, about your class environment. And don't let this be a check off, but a journey to some change, and consider the why, how, and what you're going to do to change your classwork to support an inclusive environment.